Welcome to Uriah Heep, the Magician's Podcast. I'll be covering every studio song the band has recorded and every bonus track that I can find. Each week we'll go over a new song from the beginning to where they are currently, and as they keep adding albums, I'll keep adding shows. Let the deep dive party begin.
In the magic garden, some were singing, some were dancing.
Now, I let that play a little bit longer because we have some stuff to talk about before we get to the next section. But man, that last whole segment was just full of wall-to-wall sound just coming from the keyboard, let alone what Mick and Gary were playing.
Like climbing the ladder. It's like climbing a ladder, getting to the top of the hill. It's just like, yeah. They had this really great unison run thing about every 8 or 10 bars or something. Like, just kept going. And they'd come back to the, and they do this thing with him where they give him a change of texture, if you will, and then go back to the main riff again. And they did that 2 or 3 times in there, and they're really well placed. He got done with those things. He had the freedom to keep going, knowing they hadn't done that already. And the song was still building and building. And his solo, is becoming, it's becoming alive now. He's done all the really cool, loud, distorted Ken Hensley things that everybody remembers about this kind of song from them. And now it's going to launch into something totally different. But that was an extremely well put together performance art, I think. That's the only thing I can say to describe it.
I would agree with that. And I noticed too that whereas, normally we would expect Gary to be wandering all over, he really stuck to what Mick was playing and just would go up and down the octaves, but he really wasn't being adventurous. He was allowing Ken that room to just shine. Yeah,
because I think if he broke it up and did the melodic stuff he normally does, it wouldn't have fit. This is like headbanging music to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me really miss my hair and going to concerts where I could flip my hair around. I don't know if mosh pits were around in 73, but if they were, I could see a big one forming in the crowd for a song like this.
What do you call that beat that Lee was doing? What is that?
Oh, that was just a straight 4/4 beat.
4/4 beat. Because it was so solid.
Mm-hmm.
There was nobody doing anything but playing for him to play with. You know what I mean? Like the whole band was behind him.
There weren't any drum fills. There weren't any moments of anybody else just stepping in even for a moment or two to shine. I mean, the most you heard was Gary switching octaves, and that was about it.
It was just, it's such an intense thing. I've backed up so many times listening to that 2 minutes. Because you just try to put it in your head, close your eyes. And what mountain is he climbing musically? He's going up to the peak of this mountain, and all of a sudden he's going to absolutely turn you around, and maybe you fall off, maybe you don't. But the perception I have is that he knew exactly what he was doing. Probably tried to do it this way every time. This is the way the song went. And this recording happens to be the best one, I think, like I've said before.
Well, I'm going to leave that part to your expertise because I wouldn't know. We have some interesting stuff coming up we talked about earlier that I haven't heard yet, but I know that you wanted to say some things before we get into the next section.
Well, what we're going to hear, for those of you who haven't heard it or haven't heard it for a long time, the Moog synthesizer, or the Moog synthesizer, the Model D, was what he always had on top of his keyboard. So the Hammond organ has obviously 2 manuals, 2 sets of keys. And on top of that is a Moog synthesizer. And Ken was really good at working the synth. I mean, he knew it. He knew how to make it sound like what he wanted it to sound like. So what we're going to hear is his performance pretty well, I think, the way he wanted to do it every time. This one just turned out really, really great for the recording, and they were all really pleased with it all. I'm sure he was. But, there's about 30 knobs on this thing. It looks like a little piano. And it's got a top part that sits up. And it's got synthy sounds, it's got... You're going to hear all this kind of weird stuff, and his solo coming up is the way he wanted it to sound. But the point I'm trying to get across is there's so many knobs, there's oscillators and banks of oscillators and mixers and modifiers and all kinds of things. But after you, it's like anything, when you get to know it, you can make it do what you want it to do. It's like any instrument. He was really good at it. He got really good at it. So the solo coming up is a lot of the Hammond organ behind or along with the synth. And then there's a section of just the synth. And it's really kind of complex what he did, because there's a point at where you're doing the organ synthesizer. You know, one hand's on, it has its own keyboard, so one hand's on the keyboard, you know, and the other hand is doing the knobs and twiddling the knobs and pushing buttons and flipping rocker switches and so forth and so on. And then there's also the organ going on, which takes a third hand. So I don't know how he did that, but I think he did it somehow. But at the end of the solo, you're going to hear the organ start up again. The synthesizer is still doing this thing. And there's a setting which is called sustain. There's ADSR, there's attack, decay, sustain, and release. And if you put the sustain on and the decay on full blast, the note will stay there. And you have the opportunity to twiddle knobs, and the note will just keep doing whatever the knobs are telling it to do. So you can change the frequency, and change the chromatics and all this stuff, and still have a hand free. I think that's how he did it. But it's really intense. I mean, there's controllers that make it do all kinds of weird, this is too loud, Tony. And you'll hear some of that during this. Imagine doing that and still playing the organ at the same time.
Right. Yeah, because you have to have at least one finger sliding that oscillator.
It's such a cool performance. And if you hear it in stereo, which we all do, you know, it's just him. It's just him. They put it in the middle of the stereo mix. It's really a great solo. And, you know, there's John Lord fans and there's Ken Hensley fans and there's Rick Wakeman fans. And, you know, there's guys nowadays and stuff. Everybody can do their own thing. This just happens to be the thing that Ken did. But you ask anybody who's ever heard of this, and it's really a great solo. It's really a great performance. So, you know, whoever your favorite keyboard player is, I'm sure they're aware of this, and Ken was aware of them, and it's just somebody doing his thing, and he happens to be in Uriah Heep.
Yeah, you know, and I used to be, when I was younger, I was one of those people that, like, I had to have a favorite song. I had to have a favorite song of the day, and I had to have a favorite band of the day and whatever. And as I've gotten older, what I've realized, and one of my entire points with my approach of this show, is that you don't have to have favorites. Just enjoy what you enjoy. And that's all that really matters. I've always enjoyed Ken's playing. And this was one of the songs that, you know, in the studio even, I always thought he did a really spectacular job on this song. There was just a feeling that he created that I don't think anybody else would have come up with.
So what he's doing, I mean, I don't think I was going to say for the most part, people don't experiment while they're playing live in front of them, but that's not the case. That's not the case. This whole thing is experimentation. Because back then, that's what you did. That's why your guitar solos were, you know, 10 minutes long, and keyboard solos were 10 minutes long. People did stuff like this then. You don't do that so much now, I don't think, but.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't go to a whole lot of concerts, but people seem to be a lot more refined. They don't just have live jams as much as everything seems to be kind of pre-planned. But I think too, with Uriah Heep, you're talking about musicians that absolutely could do that anytime they wanted to, if that's what they chose to do, because they were so connected to each other and they're all so talented that they could have some live jams on stage and really create something magical.
The 4 songs on this album, there's Gypsy, Circle of Hands, July Morning. There's 4 that are like showcases for Ken to wander around and do his organ stuff, you know. But I think this is the showcase song of the entire album, as far as he's concerned. As far as people listening to him, this is the song I think that pretty well sets the stage for what he wanted to be like live. If you think back, the July Morning version on this album has a very good synth solo in it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's where I was going. It was just the wrong song name, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's get into the solo, because now that you've built it up, I really want to hear it.
So now what you're going to hear is him all by himself.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, Kent Lee will come in and accompany him as he does the last half of the solo. But this is like loud organ, quiet organ, a little bit of synth, quiet organ, no organ, all synth. It's all over the place. Go for it.
All right, let's do it. Okay, I'm just going to break this here for just a second to point out something. For those of you guys that are listening on some good stereo headphones, I'm hearing the Hammond in the right ear, the Moog in the left ear. The drums are coming through nice and central, but if you've noticed, Lee Kerslake has backed off on how hard he's hitting that kick. He's really blending it in quite well.
Yeah, he's just giving a beat. He's giving a beat for what's going to come up. Yeah, he's starting this thing for Kent to start to follow, and it's going to grow.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it's not Return to Fantasy, but it sounds like they're heading into something. I haven't picked out the piece yet, but it sounds like they're heading into a piece.
I told you, they can play different parts of different songs in this thing. It's really well put together. It's like when Eddie Van Halen did his guitar solo in all his concerts. He had pieces of everything that they did that was well known in his solo. That's what Ken starts kind of doing.
So it's kind of like a medley of his own.
It's kind of fit in there, yeah. There's pieces of it. You'll hear it here and there and different things. I couldn't tell you what the songs were without looking them back up. I used to know. Dreams is in there. There's some other stuff, but you'll hear them.
Excellent. All right, let's get back to it. Dave, I want to ask you, because I have never owned a Moog before. So this one would have been monophonic, right? You couldn't play chords on it.
Monophonic, correct.
Okay. And there were no foot pedals or anything to change anything. You had to do it physically, manually on the surface of the keyboard.
Play the keys, but change the tone from the knobs and dials and switches.
So imagine, you guys, this is how he's doing everything. He's playing, but he's changing the sounds while he's going and just dialing in perfect sounds every time.
Right, so you're doing stuff, feeling stuff like that. Everything else he was doing at the same time. And that's why in that one little section he was going through this whole rigmarole up and down the keyboard, but all of a sudden the bass would come in and you said, there's three channels, if you will, that can play together. And they have six different octave ranges on all of them. So you can have, a low. And then you can, while you're playing, what he's doing is and all that's happening while he's playing. And what he's doing, as frantic as the keyboard solo, and if you back up, Scott, about 10, 12 seconds when he starts to play this keyboard solo, he's really doing a lot with his left hand or his right hand. And really doing a lot with the knobs and stuff with the other hand. It's like a wah-wah pedal, but it's more complicated because there's all kinds of different things to do rather than just be with the wah while you're playing a lead guitar solo. He's actually changing the way this thing is sounding. And all the effects that there's three things called, there's a cutoff frequency, a filter emphasis, and a contour. And those change like the middle of the oscillations of the music, of the note. Like you said, it's one note, basically. I mean, you can make it sound like multiple notes if you change the oscillators and put them in different parts of the spectrum. And you can kind of make it sound like a chord. He's not doing that, though. They're all set together, and he's having them play octaves. But all the stuff that he's doing at the same time with this solo is really remarkable. Because you have to understand, he's all by himself behind this huge organ, rocking it back and forth, playing all this junk. That's coming out really cool. And there's no note mistakes. Nothing seems to be out of the range of what should be played, not like out of key, like hitting the wrong note. You don't hear any of that. Right.
Yeah, it's flawless.
It's just a solo. It's changing every millisecond. It sounds different. Back it up about 10, 12 seconds and we'll start over again. And just keep in mind what you said, the twiddling of the knobs and all the stuff he's doing while he's playing. It's really remarkable.
I would definitely say this is a perfect example of someone who is really a master of the instrument.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. Yep. That's my feeling.
All right. I found the spot. Let's see how it sounds. And keep in mind, like Dave said, guys, keep in mind what he's actually doing while he's creating all this and playing his solo. and this is the Star Wars section of the solo where there's just a good fight going in space.
Isn't that amazing? It's like two enemies battling each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's an effect by what's called the LFO, and the LFO mod depth, or the modulation depth, and the rate at which it does it, the speed at which it vibrates. And I know that he and Lee had rehearsed this. He had to have been, because as he's intensifying his drum rolls, I don't know, what are those, triplets or quadruplets or whatever he's doing?
Triplets, yeah.
Triplets. Ken is preparing the next section for his keyboard to sound like the bomb coming down, like that whistle that was going down.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting ready for all that while he was playing. And you could hear him kind of getting in there a little bit. There was a little bit lack of musicality while he was finding the right buttons to push and rocker switches and so forth. It kind of slowed off its intensity, but Lee was increasing intensity. So when it came back together, they were all ready to go, with each other. That's my impression of how the only way this could have happened, because it takes a few seconds to get those things set up again, because there's so many knobs to deal with.
Yeah, and how you remember all of that while you're performing in front of a few thousand people and you're in the middle of a song and you're soloing with one hand and setting up the next section with it. I mean, that is so much going on for one person to manage.
And today, in the modern synthesis world, these settings are presets. They're all sampled. So you just hit a button and you get the sound that's pretty close to where you want to be. The tweakability might be there depending on what kind of keyboard that you have. But these famous sounds that you heard in all the 80s movies and 90s when synthesizers became real popular and all that, they're all presets now. There were no presets back then. You just did this.
Right. And it was pretty magical to have a brain that could track all of those things that you had to be responsible for. I mean, we've talked about, David will talk for a few seconds to give Ken a chance to set up the next song. That's just so much to do. And if it doesn't sound somewhat close to authentic, then you'll get bad reviews. They'll be like, oh, that didn't sound like Gypsy at all.
In the very beginning of this, I'll try to do this for you. It'll take just a second. Tuning up, running, and he goes, our next song is with the Moog synthesizer and organ, and that's the one Gypsy. And what you're Ken doing is this. He's trying to tune up to him. So he gets off, and the Moog had an A440 or a C, or rather, sorry, the middle A, and you tune up to that. And these had a tendency to drift because as the synth got warmer, the components in it would drift in their values. Oh. So you were always tuning it, a little bit. So there's a way to keep it in tune while you're playing. You just have to have the ear for it,
Mm-hmm. I thought it was because he was rocking it back and forth on top of the Hammond.
Yeah.
Shifted things
so
around.
You're playing the thing has a tendency to go sharp or flat. I guess probably sharp. So you bring it back down with the master tuning, and then you have these oscillators that you're trying to get back in tune with the other oscillators. But it was so frantic and so well put together, you don't even notice it.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed any of that just from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's probably not a major thing, but they did tend to drift. And that's why you tune up between songs, because when you left the last song, who knows where you were? You had to get ready for the next song, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously, and the number 2 and 3 and 1 oscillators each had their own tuner, if you will. So unless you had a tuning like a guitar tuner hooked into this thing where you could see the meter center out, you did it by ear. You did it by ear, and you used the thing on the Moog that let you tune up to it. Just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that just even makes it more impressive. The more that you learn about what he actually had to do to make the instrument work, the performance gets more and more impressive.
For a guitar player, it's a whole different set of dynamics. You're dealing with different gauges of strings and different amplifiers and different effects and different floorboards, effect and preamps and all this stuff, and the choruses and rack mounts and floor mounts and everything, Same thing with an organ, and very definitely the same thing with a synthesizer back then, because it was totally manual, as were guitar things back then. You can't tune a guitar automatically. I mean, you can now, but back then you couldn't. You had to tune up and go on out during a performance, or you break a string, you're stuck with it. You do the best you can do. And if you're out of whack on an organ, or a synthesizer rather, tune up while you're playing, because you have to. And that's what Mick did. When something went wrong, he would just fix it and keep going. And it's the same type of thing. It's exactly the same.
Right. Well, that actually leads me to a question. Thinking back in terms of like around 73, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question, but how often because Mick is playing really hard on the show, how often would he switch guitars?
Maybe once or twice during the show, but I think he wouldn't switch because he broke strings. I think he would switch because the song called for it.
I was just going to say, I was thinking that more like, he really wore that set of strings out, so he had to give it to his roadie to tune it up. So he'd play, he'd grab another guitar and play the next song. I wasn't thinking about the song calling for it. I was thinking about the instrument just because he's playing so hard, just kind of wearing out.
I have to assume they restrung it before every show. It takes a few 3 songs to get the thing to stay in tune. No matter how good you tune it up, when you start playing, you got to tune it up again a couple times. So you get tuned up, and the show carries on. And I think unless you need to change because of the song you're going to do, you break a string, you stay on the same guitar. There's no reason to change, especially with his signature sound, because Scott, he always sounded the same. Mick had that balls to the wall Mick Box sound, and I don't think he when he went from SGs to Les Pauls, they're fairly similar in the way they sound. They're very similar in the way that they play. A 60s Les Paul and a 60s SG are pretty thin necks, 60-ish, but he was probably had like a 69 SG, or I know he had a couple of Norlin era 74 Les Paul Deluxes and 72 Les Paul Deluxes, so they're similar. But you'll see him on like Don Kirshner's rock concert, those shows. He played his Strat. One time he played his Strat because he had to, and there's another song where I think he played it because he wanted to, but that's not the Mick sound. So I don't think he would change unless he had to change for the song. Obviously, when he does like Lady in Black or maybe the intro to The Wizard, they would do the acoustic. But guitar players, I don't think, unless, some Joe Walsh changes the guitar every song, because everyone likes to see all the guitars that he's got.
Oh, so it's concert, but that's a showmanship thing. That's not a necessity.
Right. That's not by necessity. Mick, I've seen him play. He just seems to have the same guitar all the time. He's playing a Carparelli now, and it's all the same. He just picks one up. One has a Floyd Rose vibrato on it. One doesn't. Depending on the song, maybe he'll switch because of the whammy bar, but other than that, he just stays where he is.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Uriah Heep, the Magician's Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, please consider going over to Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast outlet, leaving a rating or a review. Be sure to subscribe to make sure that you are notified when new episodes are available. Please be sure to share this podcast with your fellow Uriah Heep enthusiasts and anyone who you think would like Uriah Heep, which should be everyone. And if you are so inclined, please feel free to contribute to the Patreon account. And if you are not a Patreon subscriber, you can also pay through the PayPal link on the website listed in the show links below. I would also like to thank Uriah Heep for their very generous support of the show, and thank you guys for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. Happy days!